Hi, welcome to Period 4, Early America, Episode 7, The Peculiar Institution. We have a short set of notes today, but it's important stuff, so let's get started. We have two objectives. You should be able to describe how slavery shaped the social and economic relations in the Old South. You should be able to explain how the South justified the practice of slaveholding. Let's begin on Roman numeral number 15. Slavery, known as the peculiar institution in the South, didn't really die out like it was believed that the founders. The founders thought this would eventually just sort of run out on its own, but it didn't die out. It actually grew by 4 million slaves by the year 1861, which is a little outside of our timeline, but show you that it wasn't a dying institution like people thought that it might be at the time. Because cotton replaced sugar as the world's primary major crop, it was produced by slave labor in the 19th century and produced very well by slaves. The strength of American slavery rested on cotton, and as long as there was a cotton market, there was going to be a market for slavery. The cotton industry, 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the southern United States, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin, and cotton supplied the textile mills in the North and in Europe. It was both a domestic crop and an export crop. As early as 1803, cotton represented America's most important export, and by 1860 it was well over half the total of all the exports in the country. It was, like a single crop, the most important thing that America made, grew, and sold. Subpoint B. But the African slave trade had been prohibited. The sale and trade of slaves domestically in the United States flourished. So we were no longer like re-Africanizing the population, but it was all like slaves within the population where that sale continued. And more than 2 million slaves were sold from 1820 to 1860. The main business districts of the southern cities contained the offices of slave traders, and auctions took place at public slave markets. This is actually true even as far north as Kansas City on the Missouri side, which of course was a slave state. You can go to places down in Westport today. There's a real famous bar down there called Kelly's, and up on the second floor you can see the silhouettes of slaves. It was believed that Kelly's was used as an auction house during the before the Civil War, and you can see some of those legacies that lives on in our own city today. Subpoint C. And 3/4, well, I should say it doesn't really live on, but that history is remembered in Kansas City today. Big difference. Subpoint C. 3/4 of white Southerners do not own slaves. Most of them lived on self-sufficient farms. So while slavery was an important practice in the South, it was not a majority practice. 3/4 of white Southerners didn't own any slaves at all. They were basically living on farms that were either yeoman farms or self-sufficient or able to just employ farmers for whatever cotton picking needed to be done. They were not integrated in the market economy. And because they weren't integrated in the market economy, was the main reason why the South really never developed too much industry. Frankly, they made so much money growing cotton that they never developed an industry that wasn't necessary. It would have been silly to do so. You were money ahead to not develop industry and just focus entirely on cotton production. In the Upper South, slave owners made a smaller percentage of the population than in the Lower South. States like Virginia and Maryland, they had some industry. They had a more diversified economy. There, of course, remember, Virginia and Maryland are transitional states where they are moving from the South to the North, so it's the Upper South. And it's not a surprise to me, anyway, that they would also have a diversified economy that would go with that. In the Upper South, slave owners had a smaller percentage of the population. They made up a smaller percentage of the population. In the Lower South, economic growth pattern was very different. Take, for instance, the city of New Orleans. It was the only city of significant size in the South. Most of the South was not any like an urban center. New Orleans was the only exception to that, and it was a gathering point for cotton and sugar. The port of New Orleans was the world's largest exporter of slave-grown crops. The region produced less than 10% of all of the nation's manufacturing goods because slavery made agricultural so profitable for slave owners that really the South never developed any kind of an industry. The North, though, while not a slaveholding like Mecca, was not immune to slavery as either. Northern merchants and northern manufacturers participated in the slave economy. They did share in its profits. Even if they didn't outright own slaves, they were making money off of the business. Still, while most white Southerners supported the planter elite and slavery because of regional loyalty, kinship ties, and or plain old racism. So even if a person didn't own slaves in the South, they probably supported the practice. Roman numeral number 16. In 1850, the majority of slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer slaves, and fewer than 2,000 families owned 100 slaves or more. Large slave-owning plantations of 100 slaves was a very, very small number. Fewer than 2,000 families in the entire country by 1850 had more than 100 slaves. Majority of slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer. So among families that owned slaves, there was not like this huge concentration of massive plantations with just like dozens and dozens and dozens of slaves. Most of them, the families owned 5 or fewer, and very few owned over 100. That doesn't mitigate the practice, but we just got to keep our numbers in perspective on there. Ownership of slaves provided the pattern to wealth throughout the wealth, status, and influence. Men, the job of white men was to watch the world market for cotton. They invested in infrastructure. They carefully managed the details of the plantation. White women, plantation mistresses, they cared for sick slaves, oversaw the domestic servants that supervised the plantation when the master was away. So white people in the plantation culture and the plantation economic system were managing the business of cotton production with the input units of slavery to do so. Planters discouraged their son from entering manufacture. The wealthiest spent money on elegant mansions. There's really no industrial development because there's no economic reason to do so. Subpoint B. The pro-slavery argument rested on a number of pillars, including a commitment to white supremacy, a presumed biblical sanction of slavery, and the historical precedent that slavery was essential to human progress. In our last class, we met John C. Calhoun, the former vice president of the Andrew Jackson administration. He didn't carry on that position for both terms of the Jackson administration. We'll talk about him in just a second. But the paternalism was this ingrained in slave society. And paternalism, the idea that a slave owner was the sort of like father of the slave society. The paternalism was ingrained in the slave society. It enabled slave owners to think of themselves as kind, responsible masters, even as they bought and sold human property. There's still this like legacy that some people say that their ancestors were good slave owners, right? And that slaves even liked living on the plantation. That's hard. It's a hard claim to make. We'll say that. It's a hard claim to make in a world that owns humans. The outlook both masked and justified the brutal reality of slavery. By 1830, Southerners were defending slavery in terms of liberty and freedom. Without slavery, it was said that freedom was not possible, and this irony was entirely lost on the South. Post-slavery arguments began to argue against the ideas of the Declaration of Independence that equality and freedom were universal entitlements. Here we meet John C. Calhoun again. He even believed that the language in the Declaration of Independence was dangerous, which, of course, it was. Subpoint C. Between the year 1800 and 1840, slavery was abolished in most of Spanish America and the British Empire. So we see the United States is really one of the last significant countries that are engaging in the practice of slavery. Abolition in the Americas influenced debates over slavery in the United States. Pro-slavery advocates were using post-emancipation declines in sugar prices and cash crops as evidence of British abolitionism failure. The thought was, well, if a country were to give up on slavery, then economic ruin is going to come around the corner. And look, Great Britain gave up on slavery, and wouldn't you know it, at the same time the market collapses in sugar and other cash crops, and it seems like this was the gateway towards ruining the economy. Abolitionists argue that former slaves' rising standards of living showed that emancipation had succeeded. As slaves got their freedom, they were living better lives, and the rise in living standard shows that actually this was a successful future for the country. By mid-century, the New World slavery remained basically only in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. We will continue this topic in a future class, but you may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you.